In 1949, a doctor turned away a dying woman with just 5 words, and her son was Bumpy Johnson, the most dangerous man in Harlem. He didn't call the police. He didn't hire a lawyer. He disappeared for 72 hours, and when he came back, he had a plan so precise, so cold, so absolutely terrifying that an entire city held its breath. What did Bumpy Johnson do that made New York never forget his mother's name? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel smelled of fresh flowers and old money. It was the evening of January 9th, 1950, 10 months after the night that changed everything. The chandeliers above threw warm gold light across 500 faces, faces that belonged to surgeons, hospital directors, city councilmen, and the kind of women who wore pearls to events they did not particularly care about. The New York Medical Society Annual Gala, the most prestigious night in the city's medical calendar, a night for men like Dr. Raymond Harrison to be reminded of exactly who they were. Harrison stood at the podium, tall, composed, his brown hair slicked back with the precision of a man who believed presentation was everything. Beneath the sleeves of his tuxedo, gold cufflinks caught the chandelier light and threw small stars across the ceiling. He had worn those cufflinks to every important occasion in the last 14 years. They were his signature, his armor, his quiet announcement to the world that he had arrived and intended to stay. The president of the medical society was still speaking, reading from the citation in his hands. Words like distinguished service and exceptional leadership and commitment to the highest standards of American medicine floated through the room and settled over Harrison like a warm coat. He kept his expression appropriately modest, a practiced look, calibrated over years. Not too proud, not too humble, just enough of both to seem like a man who deserved exactly what he was receiving. The audience applauded. Harrison stepped forward toward the microphone, reached out to accept the heavy bronze medallion being pressed into his hands, and felt the familiar weight of it solid, real, undeniable. This was what his life looked like from the outside. This was what 20 years of Yale and residency and long nights and difficult decisions had built. He bowed his head slightly to accept the ribbon around his neck. That was when he saw it, on the seat of his chair, 3 feet behind him, where no one had been standing a moment ago. A white envelope, plain, unmarked, resting on the red velvet cushion as if it had always been there. Harrison straightened. He looked left. He looked right. The nearest person was a hospital administrator named Gerald Burke, who was busy examining his own program and not looking at anything else. No one was watching the chair. No one was moving away from it. The envelope had simply appeared, the way certain things appear in dreams without explanation, without origin, as if the world had quietly decided to place it there. Harrison kept his smile in position through sheer professional discipline. He shook the hand of the society president. He turned back to the microphone and said 3 sentences about gratitude and the privilege of service that he had prepared the week before, and he delivered them flawlessly. Then he returned to his chair, sat down, and picked up the envelope in one smooth motion, hiding it beneath the program on his lap. He did not open it until the next speaker had begun. Inside there was no letterhead, no signature, no address, just a single index card. And on it, written in black ink in a handwriting he did not recognize, precise, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who measured every stroke 7 words. I made her a promise. I keep promises. That was all. Harrison read it twice, then a third time, the bronze medallion pressed cold against his chest through the fabric of his shirt. Around him, 500 people sat listening to a speech about advances in cardiac surgery, and Harrison sat among them with a card in his hands and something crawling up the back of his neck that he had not felt in a very long time. He did not know the handwriting. He told himself he did not know what it meant. He folded the card back into the envelope, slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, and spent the remaining 2 hours of the gala performing the role of a celebrated physician with the same flawless precision he had always brought to performance. But the crawling sensation at the back of his neck did not stop. It would not stop for a very long time, because somewhere across the city of New York, in a Harlem that the Waldorf Astoria might as well have been a different planet from, a man already knew exactly what that card meant. He had written it himself, and he had been keeping that promise for 10 months, one patient and invisible step at a time. But to understand what Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson promised, and why he never broke it, you have to go back to the night it was made. You have to go back to March 12th, 1949. You have to go back to the telephone call that changed everything. The phone rang at 17 minutes past 3 in the morning. In 23 years of living the way he lived, 23 years of decisions that ended careers and altered the geography of the New York underworld, Bumpy Johnson had trained himself to wake instantly, not gradually, not reluctantly, but completely. One moment asleep, the next moment awake, alert, already processing. His hand found the receiver in the dark before his eyes had fully adjusted. The voice on the line was not one of his lieutenants. It was his sister Mabel. And she was not speaking. She was screaming. "Mama's not breathing. Bumpy. Mama's turning blue. Come for God's sake. Come." 3 seconds. That is how long Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who controlled every block from 125th to 155th Street, the man who had looked into the eyes of men who wanted him dead and felt nothing but clarity, sat frozen on the edge of his bed. 3 seconds in which his mind, trained by a quarter century in a world that rewarded speed and punished hesitation, simply refused to process what it had heard. Mama. Not breathing. Turning blue. Margaret Johnson, 62 years old. The woman who had scrubbed other people's floors in Charleston, South Carolina, so that her children could eat something other than shame. The woman who had sent him north at 15 years old because she had looked at her son's eyes and understood with the particular wisdom of black mothers in the South that a boy with his kind of fire would not survive long enough to become a man if he stayed. The woman who had prayed for him every Sunday of her life without exception, who had gotten down on her knees in front of God knowing exactly what her son did for a living and asked for his protection anyway. Because love does not come with conditions, or it does not come at all. Turning blue. Bumpy dropped the receiver. He grabbed his keys from the dresser. He ran for the door. He was halfway down the stairs before he realized he had no shoes on. He did not go back for them. He was 3 blocks into the drive before he understood that his holster was empty. No weapon. For the first time since he was 19 years old, he did not turn around. The black Cadillac screamed south down Lenox Avenue at 70 miles an hour, running every red light, the tires shrieking at every corner. 12 blocks. His mind counted them down like a man counting his last heartbeats. 11. Mama's not breathing. 10. Turning blue. 9. The Cadillac went wide around a corner and nearly took out a milk truck. Glass shattered somewhere behind him. He did not look back. In 1942, Bumpy had purchased the house on 139th Street for $35,000. Cash. His mother had stood in the doorway of her new brownstone and cried in a way he had never seen her cry before. Not from sorrow, but from something that had no name in the vocabulary of a woman who had never owned anything. She had a garden. She had a kitchen big enough for Sunday dinners. She had a home. He had given her that. It was the thing he was most proud of in a life that contained many things he was not proud of at all. 8 blocks. 7. He found Mabel in the hallway, unable to speak, her face a wreckage of terror. He pushed past her into the living room and fell to his knees beside the floral print sofa, the one his mother loved because it reminded her of her own grandmother's house, back in a South Carolina that existed now only in memory. Margaret Johnson lay with her eyes closed, her gray hair spread across the pillow like a crown. Her lips had gone blue, but her chest still moved. Barely. A trembling, shallow rise and fall that could stop at any moment. Without warning, without ceremony. She was still alive. There was still time. Bumpy lifted his mother into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her to the Cadillac and placed her in the back seat with the same careful precision with which he handled everything that mattered to him. Mabel climbed in beside her, took her hand, began to pray in a low, continuous murmur. And Bumpy drove. St. Vincent's Hospital, 4 minutes away. 4 minutes to salvation. He did not know yet that salvation was not what was waiting for him there. The emergency room of St. Vincent's Hospital at 25 minutes past 3 in the morning was quiet in the particular way that hospitals are quiet in the deep hours, not peaceful, but suspended, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Fluorescent light poured over white tile. The smell of antiseptic was sharp enough to cut. A nurse sat behind the reception desk, head bent over paperwork, not looking up. "Help!" Bumpy's voice came out raw, stripped of everything except urgency. "My mother is dying. I need a doctor right now." The nurse raised her head. Her eyes traveled across Bumpy's face, down to his bare feet, across to the frail woman in his arms with the blue-gray lips. Her expression did not shift. She reached for a clipboard and began to write. And then a door opened. He came through it the way certain men enter rooms with the absolute assumption that the room was waiting for him. Tall. Late 30s, brown hair slicked back with the same precision as his collar, which was pressed sharp enough to leave a mark. His white coat was immaculate. Beneath the sleeves, gold cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. Dr. Raymond Harrison, Yale Medical School, class of 1936. Chief resident of the St. Vincent's Emergency Department, a man who had dedicated his professional life to the principle that medicine was a science, and that science, properly practiced, separated the qualified from the unqualified, the worthy from the unworthy. The kind of people who belonged in rooms like this from the kind of people who did not. He looked at Bumpy Johnson the way a man looks at something he has not asked for and does not intend to accept. "What seems to be the problem here?" "My mother." Bumpy kept his voice steady through an act of will that cost him more than anything he had spent in 23 years. "Heart attack. Please, doctor. You have to help her. Right now." Harrison did not move toward them. He did not reach for his stethoscope. He crossed his arms over his chest in a gesture that was not hostility. Exactly, it was something quieter and colder than hostility. It was the gesture of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply administering it. "This is St. Vincent's Hospital." He spoke with the measured patience of a man explaining something to someone he did not expect to understand. "We don't treat coloreds." The world did not tilt. It did not spin. It simply stopped. Bumpy heard the words. His brain, the same brain that could calculate odds and read intentions and anticipate consequences 3 moves ahead of any situation, received them and could not, for 1 full second, find a place to put them. Surely he had misheard. Surely this man, this doctor, this person who had taken an oath in front of witnesses and God and the full weight of civilization, Surely he had not said what Bumpy thought he said. What? Harrison sighed. The sigh of a man whose afternoon has been interrupted. Harlem Hospital serves your community. It's approximately 40 blocks north. I would suggest you move quickly. He was already reaching for the telephone on the nurse's desk. 40 blocks. 15 minutes. His mother's chest was barely moving. Bumpy looked at Harrison. He looked at the gold cufflinks. He looked at the white coat, the Yale degree that existed invisibly behind every word the man had spoken. Then he looked at his mother, her closed eyes, her purple lips, the terrible stillness of a body running out of time. She won't survive 40 blocks. He heard his own voice as if it belonged to someone standing slightly behind him. Please, I am begging you. I will pay anything. $20,000, cash, tonight. Just look at her. Just. The answer is no. Something moved behind Harrison's eyes at the mention of $20,000 a flicker, quick as a candle in wind, gone before it fully arrived. What replaced it was not cruelty in the theatrical sense. It was something more ordinary and therefore more devastating. It was indifference. I'm calling the police now. I'll need you to leave. 23 years. 23 years of building an empire on the principle that no door was closed to a man who knew where to apply pressure. 23 years of never walking away from anything. And now this. Not a rival with a weapon, not a system with a crack in it somewhere. Just a man with a telephone and 5 words and the absolute confidence that the world would back him up. Bumpy stood there for 3 seconds longer. 3 seconds in which he looked at Harrison's face, really looked at it. The way he looked at faces he needed to remember, the thin mustache, the sharp collar, the gold-catching light at his wrists. I will remember your face, Bumpy said. His voice had dropped to something just above silence. I will remember those cufflinks, and when the time comes, and it will come, you will remember this moment too. I promise you that. Something passed through Harrison's eyes, gone before it could become anything real. Get out. Bumpy turned. He walked through the glass doors. The cold March air hit his face like a hand. And he drove north. He knew before he passed 125th Street, not because of anything visible, not because her breathing stopped with some dramatic finality that announced itself. He knew the way certain people know certain things, through the particular quality of a silence, through a change in the air inside the car, through the instinct of a man who had spent his life learning to read a room before anyone in it had spoken a word. He pulled to the curb. He climbed into the back seat. Margaret Johnson opened her eyes. For one moment that existed outside of time, that had no beginning and no end, and no relationship to the city outside the windows or the cold or the empty street, she looked directly at her son. Her eyes were clear. Whatever confusion the body brings in those final minutes had not reached her eyes. She saw him. He knew she saw him. Her lips moved. No sound came. But Bumpy had spent his whole life learning to read what people could not bring themselves to say aloud. My good boy. My boy. Her hand lifted from the seat, trembling, and reached toward him. He caught it in both of his. Her fingers tightened around his barely. A pressure like the last warmth leaving a stone, and then her hand went still. Her chest stopped moving. Her eyes remained open, looking at something beyond him, beyond the car, beyond the dark street and the sleeping city, and the whole long, complicated world she had navigated with such extraordinary grace. Margaret Johnson left the world at 11 minutes past 4 in the morning on March 12, 1949. She died in the back seat of her son's Cadillac, 15 blocks short of Harlem Hospital, 45 blocks from St. Vincent's. She died because a man with gold cufflinks had decided her life was not worth the inconvenience of saving. Bumpy sat with his mother's hand in his for 43 minutes. He did not cry. He did not speak. He did not move except to bow his head. Slowly, until his forehead rested against her still fingers. Around him, Harlem slept. Somewhere distant, a siren moved through the city and faded. The Cadillac sat in the dark on a street that did not know what had just happened inside it. On the floor, a pink knitted slipper had fallen, one his mother had made herself, with her own hands, the same hands that had held him when he was sick, the same hands that had waved goodbye from a Charleston porch all those years ago. Bumpy would go back for that slipper. He would wash it and dry it carefully, and place it in the pocket of whatever he wore from that day forward, for the rest of his life. Not as a reminder of grief. Grief does not need reminders. As a compass. As a promise. When he finally stepped out of the car, dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky above Harlem. He stood on the pavement, with his bare feet cold against the asphalt, and looked south toward the invisible skyline where St. Vincent's Hospital stood. 72 hours, he said quietly. To no one. To the city. To whatever listened at that hour. That is how long you have left. Doctor. Rest well. Then he turned and walked back toward his building, and the door closed behind him. And the man who had carried his dying mother through the streets of New York in bare feet went inside to begin planning with the same cold, patient, absolute precision that had built everything he owned. Harrison slept soundly that night. He always slept soundly. It was one of the things he privately considered a mark of a clear conscience, the ability to close one's eyes and sink immediately into untroubled darkness. He took no pill to achieve it. He required no ritual. He lay down, and he slept. And the city moved around him without disturbing him at all. He did not know that 45 blocks north, a man sat in a dark room with a pink slipper in his hands and eyes that had not closed once. He did not know that the 5 words he had spoken in less than 4 seconds were already being arranged into the architecture of something he could not yet imagine. He did not know that Bumpy Johnson never made a promise he did not keep. That night, Harrison slept better than he had in months. It was the last time he ever would. For 48 hours, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson ceased to exist. Not in the way a man disappears when he runs. Not in the way a man vanishes when he is afraid. Bumpy Johnson disappeared the way a storm disappears in the hours before it arrives completely. Quietly, in a manner that made the air feel wrong without anyone being able to explain precisely why. His telephone rang unanswered. His usual booth at the pool hall on 143rd Street sat empty. His Cadillac did not move from the curb outside his building. The operations that generated $200,000 a month continued running on their own momentum. Like a clock that has been wound so precisely, it does not require a hand to keep it ticking, but the man who had wound it was gone. His lieutenants gathered in doorways and back rooms and spoke in the low, urgent tones of men who understand that uncertainty is the most dangerous condition their world can produce. Jackie Williams knocked on Bumpy's apartment door 20 times over 2 days. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing. No movement, no voice, no sound of any kind. On the 3rd knock of the first morning, he thought he heard something. Not a footstep, not a word, just the faint, particular silence of a room that contains a person who has decided not to be found. Marcus Cole said what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say first. If something happened to him inside there. Nothing happened to him, Jackie said. He said it with more certainty than he felt. When something happens to Bumpy Johnson, we'll know. The whole city will know. He was right about that, But what was happening to Bumpy Johnson in that room was not the kind of thing that makes noise. The room was dark. Bumpy had pulled the curtains on the first morning and had not touched them since. The telephone he had unplugged from the wall. The food that Mabel left outside his door each evening sat untouched in the hallway until she took it away and replaced it the next day with something else, her hands moving quietly, the way you move around grief that belongs to someone else. Bumpy sat at the small table in the corner of his bedroom. On the table, a single lamp turned low. 3 sheets of paper, a pencil, a ruler, and the pink knitted slipper placed at the top right corner of the workspace like a compass that always pointed in the same direction. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He thought dough. This was the thing that people who feared Bumpy Johnson misunderstood about him. They feared him for his reputation, for his reach, for the men who moved when he spoke. They feared the wrong things. The genuinely dangerous thing about Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the thing that had allowed a boy from Charleston with no family connections and no institutional backing to build an empire that the most powerful criminal organizations in New York had tried and failed to dismantle, was not his willingness to act. It was his willingness to think, completely, without rushing, without the distortion of anger or pride or impatience. He had been angry the night his mother died. That anger had been real and enormous, and it had lived in his chest like a coal for every second of the 43 minutes he sat in the back of that Cadillac. But anger, Bumpy understood, was a fire that consumed the person carrying it first. He had put it down. Not away, you do not put that kind of anger away. He had converted it into something cooler and more useful. The way a furnace converts raw heat into the precise energy that drives a machine. On the first sheet of paper, he drew the floor plan of St. Vincent's staff dormitory from memory. He had been inside that building twice, years ago, for reasons unrelated to medicine. He remembered it the way he remembered everything completely, involuntarily, the way certain minds record spaces and faces and details without being asked to. 3rd floor, east-facing rooms, the fire escape on the eastern exterior, the covered walkway connecting the dormitory to the main hospital building, the single staircase at the center of the structure. On the second sheet, he wrote a list of names, 9 names, each one accompanied by a specific capability, a specific task, a specific window of time. On the 3rd sheet, he wrote 2 numbers, 72 and 317. 72 hours from the moment his mother had called for help, and 317 the exact minute of the morning that her call had come, because Bumpy Johnson believed that justice, when it came, should arrive at the precise coordinates of the wound it was answering. He sat with those 3 sheets for 48 hours. He revised. He considered. He found the weaknesses in his own plan and corrected them the way a chess player finds threats 5 moves before they materialize. When he finally stood up from that table, he was not angry. He was not grieving. He was something far more focused than either of those things and far more dangerous. He opened his door. Jackie Williams was sitting on the floor of the hallway with his back against the opposite wall, waiting, as he had been waiting, with the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed. "Get everyone," Bumpy said. His voice came out rough from 2 days of silence. "Clayton's basement. Midnight." Jackie looked up at him. He took in the unshaven face, the unchanged clothes, the eyes that were not red from weeping but from something else entirely, from the particular exhaustion of a mind that had not rested because it had been working. He did not ask if Bumpy was all right. The question would have been an insult. "Who am I looking for first?" Jackie asked. "A doctor." Bumpy said, "Raymond Harrison, everything. Where he lives, where he eats, what time he sleeps. I want his life on paper by tonight." Jackie nodded once and stood. And Jackie. Bumpy paused. 3 cans of gasoline. Clean ones. Nothing traceable. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Then Jackie walked away without another word, and Bumpy went back inside to put on his shoes. The basement of Clayton's funeral parlor on 138th Street smelled of 2 things that should not have existed in the same room. Formaldehyde drifting through the floorboards from the preparation rooms above, and the sharp mineral bite of fresh gasoline from the 3 metal canisters Bumpy had set beneath the folding table at the center of the space. The combination was not pleasant. No one mentioned it. 9 men sat or stood in the cone of light thrown by a single bare bulb overhead. Wooden crates, concrete walls, the muffled sound of a city that did not know this meeting was happening. Bumpy stood at the head of the table in a black suit. His face was clean-shaved now. His eyes were clear. He looked, Jackie would say later, like a man who had gone somewhere very dark and come back with something he had found there, something he intended to use. "You know why we're here," Bumpy said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to raise his voice. "My mother died 3 days ago. She died because a doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital refused to treat her. His name is Raymond Harrison, 38 years old. Yale. Class of 36. He lives in the staff dormitory at St. Vincent's, a 3rd floor, room 307. He spread the papers across the table. Floor plans, a hand-drawn map, a schedule written in Jackie's handwriting. He takes a sleeping pill every night, a strong one. He is unconscious by midnight and does not wake for external disturbances. He let the men look at the papers. He watched their faces as they read the narrowing of eyes, the slight forward lean of men whose minds were already moving toward execution. Marcus Cole looked up first. "We take him at the hospital. We don't touch him." Bumpy's voice was level. "Not one finger." The room went still in a specific way. The stillness of men who expected one thing and received another. "Then what?" Thomas Grant asked. Bumpy reached beneath the table and set the 3 gasoline canisters down with a sound that filled the basement completely. "My mother spent her last 20 minutes on Earth in the back of my car, turned away at a door that should have been open to her. I want Harrison to understand what that feels like. Not to read about it, not to be told about it, to feel it, every second of it." He placed his finger on the building plan. "The staff dormitory, eastern exterior, fire escape, 1st floor office windows, covered walkway, 7 ignition points, simultaneous. The fire will climb the eastern face of the building fast enough to block his window and his fire escape within 90 seconds of ignition." Samuel Hayes leaned forward. "And the staircase. Clear. West side entirely untouched. Every other person in that building walks out in under 2 minutes." Bumpy looked around the table. No patients, no nurses, no innocent people. "Samuel, the fire alarm goes at 3:15. That gives everyone 2 minutes to evacuate before the fire starts at 3:17. The only person left in that building when the fire begins will be the man in room 307, who sleeps through alarm bells because of a pill he takes every night at midnight." "The room absorbed this," Thomas Grant said, very quietly. "That is exact." "It needs to be," Bumpy said. He pulled the pink slipper from his jacket pocket and held it on the table in front of him. Not as a performance, just as a fact, a small pink object that explained everything that needed explaining. "And Marcus, I need people on the street, not a crowd. Witnesses, people who know who Harrison is and what he said. They'll come when they see the fire. Word has already moved through the neighborhood. Half of Harlem knows what happened to my mother. The other half will know by tomorrow." He looked at each man in turn. "Harrison will come to the window. He will ask for help. And every person standing on that street will give him exactly as much help as he gave my mother." He paused. "None." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Jackie said, softly, "When?" Bumpy looked at the clock on the wall above the door. 62 hours, he said. March 17th, 3:17 in the morning. Dr. Raymond Harrison's life, observed from 30 meters away over the course of 48 hours, was a study in the serenity of a man who believes himself beyond consequence. He took his coffee at 7:15 each morning in the hospital cafeteria, always at the same corner table, always with the same newspaper folded to the same section. He moved through his ward rounds with the unhurried authority of a man for whom the hospital was not a workplace, but a kingdom. He spoke to nurses in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to being understood on the first attempt, and not particularly interested in whether the exchange was pleasant for the other party. He was not cruel in the theatrical sense. He did not shout. He did not demean. He simply existed in a manner that communicated, at every moment, that his time was more valuable than yours, and that this was not an opinion but an objective fact that the universe had already settled. Jackie Williams watched all of this from cafeterias and corridors and the street outside, with the particular invisibility that a black man in 1949 New York could achieve simply by performing the role the city had already decided he was there to perform: maintenance worker, delivery man, passerby. He wrote everything in a small notebook: times, routes, habits, the precise moment. Each night, when the light in room 307 went dark, 12:43 on the first night, 12:38 on the second. The rhythm of a man who did not vary because he had never needed to. On the second afternoon, Harrison stood at the window of his office on the third floor and looked out at the street below. And for one moment, one coincidental, unremarkable moment, his gaze passed across the figure of Jackie Williams standing on the opposite sidewalk. Harrison's eyes moved on immediately. He saw nothing worth seeing. He turned back to his desk. Jackie did not move. He wrote the time in his notebook. He closed it. He walked away. The trap had been closing for 48 hours, 1 millimeter at a time. And the man inside it was drinking coffee and reading newspapers and sleeping soundly every night. Because that is what men do when they cannot imagine that the world might have decided to rearrange itself around them. March 17th arrived cold and clear, with a half-moon hanging above Manhattan and a thin river fog beginning to move in from the Hudson as midnight passed. By 2 in the morning, the streets around St. Vincent's had settled into the deep silence of a city between one day and the next. A night watchman in the dormitory lobby dozed over yesterday's newspaper. In room 307 on the third floor, the curtains were drawn and the light was off, exactly as they had been every night at the same hour. At 3:15 in the morning, the fire alarm shattered the silence of the building like something thrown through glass. In the corridors, doors flew open. Nurses in robes, junior doctors in pajamas, orderlies who had been half asleep already came stumbling into the hallways, following the red emergency lights toward the staircase, toward the lobby, toward the cold street outside. 63 people evacuated the St. Vincent staff dormitory in 88 seconds. They gathered on the sidewalk across the street, pulling coats around themselves, looking up at the dark building and wondering whether this was a drill. None of them looked back at the third floor. None of them registered that room 307 was still dark, still silent, its curtains still drawn. Dr. Harrison was not well liked. He was not the kind of man people thought to check on in a crisis. He kept to himself. And in turn, the world was keeping to itself now. At 3:17, the fire began. 7 points, simultaneous. The wooden fire escape on the eastern exterior caught first old dry timber, soaked in accelerant going up with a sound like a held breath finally released. Orange light climbed the building's face in seconds, reaching for the third floor with a speed and hunger that was almost organic, almost alive. The first-floor office windows caught next, glass cracking from the heat, flames spilling inward. Then the covered walkway collapsed on itself in a cascade of burning timber, cutting the dormitory's connection to the main hospital completely. In room 307, Dr. Raymond Harrison did not wake up, not from the alarm, which had long since exhausted itself against his pharmaceutical sleep, not from the shouts on the street below, not from the sound of the fire escape beginning to fail outside his window. He woke up because of the smell. Smoke. Sharp. Unmistakable. The kind of smell that the human brain recognizes before consciousness has fully assembled itself. Harrison's eyes opened in complete darkness. His head was thick from the sleeping pill. For 2 full seconds he lay still, trying to locate himself in the familiar geography of his room. Then the smell reached him again, stronger now, and he saw it the orange light moving at the edges of his curtains. Not the orange of street lamps. Something different, something that pulsed. He threw off his covers and crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled back the curtain. The fire escape outside his window was a column of flame, 20 feet of burning timber pressed against the glass, close enough that he felt the heat against his face before he had fully registered what he was seeing. Below. The first floor was an inferno. The walkway was gone. The entire eastern face of the building was wrapped in fire from the ground to within feet of where he stood. Harrison spun toward his door. His training moved him systematic, automatic. He pressed his palm flat against the wood before opening it, felt the heat on the other side, and understood. He pulled it open 1 inch. Black smoke rolled toward him like a physical force, filling his mouth and eyes in the single second before he slammed it shut again. He stood in the center of his room and understood, with the clinical precision of a man trained to assess conditions rapidly, that there was no way out except the window with the burning fire escape outside it. He grabbed the desk chair. He swung it at the glass. The window shattered outward, and the night air came in carrying smoke and heat and the roar of fire that was suddenly, shockingly loud. The fire had been silent through the glass. Manageable, like watching something terrible at a distance. And now it was here. Immediate, filling the room. Harrison leaned out over the sill. 3 stories, 30 feet to the pavement below. He could jump, might survive, might not. Or he could wait for the fire department. Where was the fire department? He opened his mouth and he screamed for help. Below him on the sidewalk, he saw his colleagues from the dormitory, still gathered where they had evacuated. He saw neighbors from the surrounding streets drawn by the light and the noise. And behind them, filling the street and the sidewalk and the space between the buildings in both directions, he saw faces he had not expected. Hundreds of faces. Black faces. People who had come from the blocks around this hospital in the deep hours of the morning and who stood now in the firelight and looked up at him in complete silence. Not anger. Not shouting. Not the aggressive energy of a mob that wants something. Just stillness. Just eyes looking up. 300 people standing in the street at 3 in the morning, watching a man in his nightclothes hang from a 3rd-floor window. And not one of them moving. "Help!" Harrison's voice tore out of him. "Someone get a ladder. Please, someone help me. Call the fire department. Please." Nothing moved. A voice rose from somewhere in the crowd. Calm, unhurried, as if commenting on a thing of mild interest. "Scream louder, doctor. Maybe someone will hear you." A pause. Like she screamed. Another voice. Quieter. "Where are your gold cufflinks now?" Harrison looked down at those faces, and felt something arrive in his chest that he had no framework for. Because in 38 years of living he had never needed a framework for it. It was the particular terror of understanding completely, inescapably, with every nerve in his body, what it means to call for help and receive only the face of a world that has decided you are not worth the trouble. His arms burned, his hands cramped against the window frame. Smoke poured over his shoulders from the room behind him. He was crying, he could feel it. The tears cutting through the soot on his face, and the humiliation of it was enormous. The humiliation of a man who had never cried in front of anyone crying now in front of 300 strangers who were watching with the patient attention of people who have waited a long time for something and are not going to look away. Beneath a chestnut tree at the edge of the crowd, in a shadow deep enough that no firelight reached him, a man stood with his hands in the pockets of a black coat. He did not smile. He did not call out. He did not move. He simply watched, with the absolute stillness of a man who has planned something completely and is now watching it unfold exactly as planned. His right hand, inside his pocket, was closed around a small pink object, and his grip on it was gentle, careful. The way you hold something that belongs to someone you loved. Harrison hung from that window for 12 minutes. 12 minutes of fire behind him and pavement below, and the roar of the city and the silence of 300 people who had collectively, without a word between them, made a decision that required no meeting and no plan. 12 minutes of understanding, 1 second at a time. What a woman named Margaret Johnson had felt in the back of a Cadillac 45 blocks south and 5 days ago. The fire trucks arrived at 3:31. A ladder went up. Hands reached for him and pulled him down, and he collapsed onto the pavement, and the crowd, as silently as it had gathered, began to move away back into Harlem, back into the dark streets, carrying with them a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Harrison sat on the curb wrapped in a blanket, his hands shaking, his face streaked with soot and tears, his eyes fixed on nothing. He was alive. Every bone in his body was intact. He had not been touched by a single person in that crowd. This was not mercy. This was the plan. Harrison would not understand that until much later, in the hours immediately after. Sitting on that curb, while firefighters moved around him and colleagues he barely knew placed hands on his shoulders and said things he could not hear. He felt only the primitive and overwhelming relief of a man who has survived something unsurvivable. He did not yet understand that surviving was not the end of what Bumpy Johnson had designed for him. It was only the beginning. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something about punishment that courts and prisons and the machinery of official justice had never grasped, that the worst thing you can do to a man is not take his life. It is make him live inside the consequences of who he is every single morning, for the rest of it. Harrison was alive. He had his heartbeat, his lungs, his Yale degree framed on the wall of a room that had not burned. Everything else was already gone, he simply did not know it yet. The collapse of Raymond Harrison's life made no dramatic sound. There was no single morning when everything ended. There was instead a slow and merciless sequence of doors closing, each one quietly, each one finally, each one leaving him standing in a hallway that was slightly shorter than the one before. St. Vincent's accepted his resignation before he could be formally removed. The 3 hospitals he applied to afterward did not call back. The 4th sent a letter so brief it was almost courteous in its efficiency. 2 sentences. No explanation. No appeal process referenced. By the 5th week after the fire, the phone on his desk had stopped ringing entirely, and the silence of it was louder than anything the fire had produced. He moved into a rented room in a boarding house in Lower Manhattan. The room had a window that faced a brick wall, a radiator that knocked through the night, and enough space for a single bed, a chair, and the one thing he had carried from his office before he left St. Vincent's For the last time, his Yale diploma, in its dark wood frame, hung on the nail that was already in the wall when he arrived, as if the room had been expecting it. He sat in that chair and looked at it for many days, the document that had organized his entire understanding of himself, the credential that had told him, for 14 years, what kind of man he was and what kind of world he was entitled to move through. It hung there on the brick-colored wall and said nothing useful to him at all. One morning he took it down. He did not break it. He simply placed it face down under the bed. And after that the wall was blank, and the room felt both emptier and more honest than it had before. His medical license went under formal review in April. By June, the outcome was clear to everyone except those required by procedure to pretend it was not. Letters continued to arrive from churches and newspapers and civic organizations across 12 states, not angry letters, which he might have found easier to dismiss, but precise, documented, institutional letters that described what he had done in the language of professional boards and used words like conduct of becoming and dereliction of duty and irrecoverable breach of the physician's oath. Each one added weight to a scale that had already tipped beyond recovery. The world had not forgotten. It was simply taking its time. Marcus Garvey Square, May 17th, 1949. Gray sky. 2,000 people gathered under it without a sound. Harrison walked to the wooden platform, looking like a man who had already served his sentence and was performing only its final administrative requirement. He was thinner than he had been. His hair had gone gray at the temples, in the 2 months since the fire, not the distinguished gray of a man aging well, but the abrupt gray of a man who has experienced something his body has not finished processing. His hands, when he unfolded the paper he had prepared, were shaking with a tremor he could not control and had stopped trying to. In the front row, Bumpy Johnson stood with his arms at his sides and his right hand inside his jacket pocket. He wore the same black suit he had worn to his mother's funeral. His face showed nothing. Not satisfaction, not anger, not grief. Just the complete and unblinking attention of a man bearing witness to something he had decided, long ago, needed to be witnessed. Harrison's voice, when it came, was barely a voice at all. On the night of March 12th, a woman named Margaret Johnson was brought to St. Vincent's Hospital. He stopped, started again. She needed immediate care. I refused to provide it. I told her son to take her elsewhere. Another stop. The paper in his hands shook visibly. Margaret Johnson died that night because of my decision, because of my prejudice, because of my... His voice broke completely. He stood at the microphone with his mouth open and nothing coming out. A man trying to find words adequate to what he had done and discovering, as people always discover in these moments, that no such words exist. "I am sorry," he finally said. "I am so sorry." 2,000 people stood in the gray morning air and did not move. No one spoke. No one offered the small mercies that crowds sometimes offer: the murmur, the rustle, the collective exhale that tells a person they have been heard and something has shifted. There was only silence. The same silence that had looked up at him from the street on the night of the fire. The same silence that had held him suspended between the burning building and the pavement for 12 minutes. The same silence that was not empty, but full of every door that had ever been closed, every voice that had not been heard, every life that had been weighed and found not worth the trouble. Harrison walked off the platform and through the crowd, and no one touched him, and no one spoke to him, and he disappeared into the city like smoke into open air. 3 months later, he was gone entirely. A Philadelphia boarding house, his clothes in the closet, his wallet on the dresser, and no Raymond Harrison anywhere inside or outside the building. The police found nothing. The case remained open, and in Harlem, people read the headline and understood, without needing to be told anything further, that the story had reached its conclusion. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, at a restaurant table in Harlem of a heart attack, surrounded by the neighborhood he had spent his life governing. He was 62 years old, the same age his mother had been on the night she died. The pink knitted slipper was in the pocket of his jacket. It was still there when they buried him, at his family's request, beside Margaret Johnson in the same ground. Thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Politicians and criminals and ministers and schoolteachers and numbers runners and grandmothers who had never broken a law in their lives. The city did not know how to categorize him. So it did what cities do with men they cannot categorize. It made him a legend and left the complications for history to sort out. St. Vincent's Hospital installed a small bronze plaque near the entrance of its emergency department sometime in the years that followed. 4 words. Every life has value. It did not name Margaret Johnson. It did not explain itself. But every person in Harlem who walked past it knew exactly what it meant, and exactly what it had cost to put it there. The question that remains the question that has no clean answer, and perhaps should not have one, is where the line sits, between justice and something darker, between a son's love and a man's power, between what the law would not do and what one man decided he would. Bumpy Johnson never claimed to be a good man. He claimed only to keep his promises. And on a March morning in 1949, standing barefoot on a cold Harlem street with his mother newly gone, he made one. Perhaps that is the only verdict that matters. Not what the courts would have said. The courts were never going to say anything at all. But what history says, quietly, to the people who know how to listen, that there was a woman named Margaret Johnson, that she deserved better, that someone remembered, and that some promises, once made, do not end until they are kept.